I'm Laura McKeever in for John Beattie. First of all, though, to the Scottish Parliament. Work resumes today after the summer break. After all the talk about Brexit, MSPs will today have to focus on the other issues which matter to so many people. At 2 o'clock this afternoon, the First Minister will outline her government's legislative programme. It's a bit like the Queen's speech, a list of all the legislation the SNP government will bring into Holyrood in the next year. So what should be their priority? Education, the economy, maybe a second independence referendum. Let's rattle through a few different priorities. According to one research group, it should be poverty. The Joseph Roundtree Foundation says 13 million people live in poverty across the UK. They say governments should have a much longer-term strategy, and they want more government intervention to cope with major job losses such as the collapse of British home stores and redundancies in the North Sea oil industry. I've been chatting with Helen Barnard from the Joseph Roundtree Foundation.
What we've found is there are 13 million people across the country who are living in poverty. And what that means is they're waking up every day with insecurity, with uncertainty, with impossible decisions to make about juggling money. So whether to pay the rent or pay the water bill or buy their children new school shoes. And what we can see is that the effect that has on people, that constant stress, is it affects their health, their education, their prospects and their relationships. So what we've found is that poverty doesn't just damage individuals and families, it actually costs the UK £78 billion a year, just picking up the pieces from the damage that living on those very low incomes does to people.
And how do you define living in poverty?
Well, we define poverty as when your income is substantially below what you need to meet your essential needs. So we've spent time talking with the public about what it is that all households and families should be able to afford. And then we've looked at how far below that level people fall. And we've found that once people kind of fall around 3/4 of that level, they start really having to do without things which most of us would take for granted. And what we can see is that then really affects everything else in people's lives. And it means that we have to spend a lot more on our health service, on our education, on social services, helping people deal with the impacts of all that. And of course, we have to spend more on our benefit system. And we also get less tax in because people aren't able to get jobs, or they're only able to get very low paid jobs. So what our strategy does is set out what can be done across 5 different areas which would really solve this problem through a partnership between different governments, business and communities all working together.
Well, the First Minister of Scotland's actually setting out her programme for government today. What kind of things would actually help? What kind of policies are you talking about that you think could make a difference?
Well, what we think we need to do is, first of all, to boost people's incomes and to reduce their living costs. So things like housing costs and childcare costs, and what's called the poverty premium, where people in poverty can end up paying more for essential goods and services than people on higher incomes.
How is that? Just explain how that works then.
Well, there are different ways that happens. So, for instance, people on low incomes are often using prepayment meters for energy, and the cost of that is much higher than if you're able to have a direct debit. People in poverty also, when they need to buy something like a washing machine, quite often they can't afford to pay for it as a lump sum, and they can't get access to reasonable credit, so they end up buying it on very expensive credit arrangements. So what we think is that governments and regulators and businesses can do something about that to really make the kind of markets work fairly for people in poverty. But we also need to think about the long term and people's prospects. So one of the things we want to see is a radical reforming of childcare across the UK to improve quality, to improve access and affordability. And obviously that's been a big focus for the First Minister and the Scottish Government. But one of the things we think is that all the funding for childcare needs to be devolved to Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, so that those governments can really put together a strategy that will suit the needs in their countries.
And you talk also about welfare. Welfare is something, there are now new powers devolved to the Scottish Parliament to deal with welfare. What kind of changes would you like to see? You talk particularly about universal credit.
Yeah, so we think that we need an effective safety net. So there's a couple of big things we think need to happen. One is we need to really reboot universal credit to make it a proper poverty fighting tool. So in its original design, it was doing quite a lot to make work pay, to help people move out of poverty. But over time, some of that's been kind of chipped away at. So we want to put back in a lot of the features which will really help people to not just get into work, but work more hours when they can and progress in their pay. We also think that the safety net needs to keep up with costs. So as the cost of living is rising, we think the safety net needs to keep up with that. But the third thing we think is that job centres need to really refocus on helping people to earn more and to improve their income. So not just go into any job, but to find a job that will give them some prospects for moving forward in the future, earning a little bit more, getting a bit more security. And we think it's a great opportunity for the Scottish Government and for local authorities to really start taking a leading role in this, to give the kind of employment support that will lead to long-term, sustainable, decently paid work. And that will then have massive knock-on effects for saving the country money and for improving people's lives. Mm.
That was Helen Barnard there from the Joseph Roundtree Foundation. Now back to our main story, and we're told that education will be at the heart of the First Minister's agenda for government. 29 new schools will be completed this year as part of the government's £1.8 billion building programme. And the Education Secretary, John Swinney, has been tasked with narrowing the attainment gap between pupils from affluent and deprived backgrounds. Professor Sue Ellis is the co-director of the Education and Social Policy Centre at Strathclyde University's School of Education, and she's come in to see us. Hello, thank you for coming in, Sue.
Hello.
So the attainment gap, this age-old question, how do we close it?
Well, I think that we need to be aiming for sustainable improvements, and that means we need to actually understand the different ways that the attainment gap actually opens up in the first place. So some of the ways that it opens up are really quite subtle, and some are not so subtle. Some of the subtle ways don't appear in themselves to actually cause much of a problem, but it's a multiplier of disadvantage. When they're laid onto other things, it does. We know that, and those subtle ways, teachers can actually do quite a lot about that, which it doesn't cost any money at all. It just
give us an example
awareness.
Of what kind of subtle things they could do.
Well, for example, we know that middle-class parents spend quite a lot of time cultivating their children's childhoods. They sign them up to clubs, and they then spend a lot of time ferrying them around from club to club to club. What the child learns from that is that the parents that they're the centre of their parents' world, and they can ask adults for help. And they get a sense of entitlement. And we know that middle-class parents spend a lot of time whinging and whining about stuff. But what they're doing in that whinging and whining is actually saying, this is how I want my world organised according to my needs.
Raising expectations.
It's expectations, but it's also their sense of entitlement that you are there to help me and that I can ask for help. We know that children in poverty, on the other hand, often have parents who are working quite a few jobs, they're under stress. They don't have the same approach to childhood. It's much more sort of free-range approach to growing up. And they don't dance attention around their children in exactly the same way. What that means for children is that they don't ask for stuff because they know their parents can't afford it. And they don't believe that they have that sense of entitlement.
And do they take that to the classroom? When
they get into the classroom, what happens is that if they have a problem, even very young children in primary 1, 2 and 3, if they have a problem, the middle-class child will instantly look at the teacher and get the teacher to help. And if the teacher doesn't provide immediate help, they will get out of their seat and they will get the teacher to help them. The child in poverty is much more self-reliant, but doesn't actually necessarily think that the teacher is going to provide them that help. They don't ask. If they do ask, they sit with their hand up rather than insisting that the teacher pays attention to their problems and issues. So in that way, that very small multiplier of that's very small disadvantage actually multiplies because, of course, the kids who get on fastest are the ones who get the most teacher help. So there are things like that are part of the system of education. But there are other things to do with the way that we teach in classrooms and the way that we and what we teach that are equally important. So schools need to look at what's going on in the classroom and how to teach the teaching. They need to look at the systems that and how children engage with systems like getting teachers' attention, but also things like providing homework clubs and who gets access to those homework clubs. And they need to look at the wider community and how they network children into work, how they network children into wider cultural experiences, and how they work with families and communities and actually make schools a very vibrant place that actually grows children's sense of who they are and how they can engage with the wider world.
Are we focusing too much on national testing? Or how do we decide the ways that we measure attainment, whether it's national testing, exam results? Is there enough focus on that? Is there too much tinkering with that?
Well, at the moment in Scotland, we don't actually have any official testing until kids leave school. And when they do that, we actually find that the system hasn't been fair. And that's not okay. You actually do need to give teachers, head teachers, local authorities the tools to actually see whether the system's fair or not. Now, the National Improvement Framework that they've introduced has got a whole range of different sorts of data. So it's got data that's based on people's experiences and sort of narrative type of data. It's got data based on surveys about children's reading engagement, about how parents feel about school, and it's got data about test scores. All of that data needs to work together, all right? It's not one or the other. And what's good and useful about test scores is that it can actually tell you who the system's benefiting and who it's not benefiting, and make you ask questions about the system that you provide. You can then go into some of your narrative data and actually work out why that is, because the pathways to impact are not always absolutely clear.
Yeah, we have quite a uniform system here in Scotland, don't we? Down south, they have academies, they have different types of schools. Here it's slightly different. Should head teachers be given more autonomy, more tailored budgets to make their own decisions for what might be right for their particular school?
Well, I think head teachers have already got that. I mean, we've got a much less centralised system than England, for example, where they have a national curriculum and every teacher has to teach that. So head teachers do have that power. What they don't have is the sort of devolved budgets they have down south. Now, I think the idea to introduce some sort of pupil premium is actually quite a good idea for Scotland, because the geography of Scotland is such that we know that almost 2/3 of children in poverty don't go to schools that are zoned and to serve poor areas. So giving head teachers a pupil premium that according to how many pupils in poverty they've got is a good, sensible way forward. But you also need the knowledge to help those head teachers spend it wisely, and you need to make sure that the head teachers are actually tracking whether or not what they're spending it on is actually helping to reduce the attainment gap.
Just finally and quickly, Sue, new school buildings, lots more being built. We've heard a lot of negative news about school buildings as well, but generally speaking, does a brand new building raise attainment? Does it actually help?
I think everyone deserves a reasonable place in which to work. Teachers deserve it, but children deserve it as well. So we need a building that's fit for purpose. We know from the school buildings that we've had so far that some of them are really good and some of them are not so good. So we need to look at the ones that teachers and children are saying are working really, really well, and actually look at the design features of those and scale those up. We need to also look at the finance to make sure that the finance programmes that fund the school buildings are suitably flexible to allow for changes in the population in future.
Thank you so much for coming in. Professor Sue Ellis there of Strathclyde University's School of Education. The Minister's legislative speech this afternoon will talk about Brexit and the economy, but many workers and campaigners want to hear Nicola Sturgeon talk about health services in Scotland. Dave Watson is Scottish organiser for Unison. He's on a picket line with college workers in Glasgow today, and he joins us now. Dave, good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon to you.
And we'll discuss health in a moment, but quickly, you're campaigning today, as I said, for staff at further education colleges.
Yep, essentially college support workers are on strike today for fair pay. They signed up for a flat rate pay rise without realising that this meant a two-tier pay rise, where college principals who have awarded themselves telephone number pay awards are resisting a couple of £100 for some of the lowest paid workers in public services. And it's a good example of the sort of changes we need to see, we're hoping to see in the legislative programme today.
And in terms of health services in Scotland, there's of course been so much distraction recently because of BrExit and concerns about the Scottish economy. But what are you wanting and hoping to hear from the First Minister today in regard to the NHS?
Well, I think our first priority would be to hear that there's going to be concerted government action on particularly social care elements. There are nearly 1,500 people in hospital who shouldn't be there, and this requires us to tackle home care. This means better pay so that we can recruit and retain workers. It means proper training, and most importantly, it means giving care staff the time to care properly. 30-minute care visits are now becoming 20-minute care visits, 15-minute ones are becoming 10. This just isn't acceptable in the civilised society, and it must be the Scottish Government's first priority.
And the Scottish Conservatives have called for action on warm homes. That's one of the things they're highlighting today. They're pointing out the pressure that ill health related to this actually puts on health services. Do you think that that is a big issue, a big problem, especially as we approach winter?
Well, it is. Fuel poverty is a massive problem. I do think the Conservatives would probably spend their time better if they spoke to their colleagues in Westminster, who are the cause of most of the austerity cuts. But we would agree that fuel poverty should be a high priority, and that means essentially addressing the damp, cold homes, which underpin a lot of illness that our members see when they visit their clients and patients in their own homes.
And just going back to what you said there about home care over hospital care, can you elaborate a bit about that?
Well, we've got nearly 1,500 people who are rather disparagingly called bed blockers, but actually it's just people who have been diagnosed as fit to return home, and they're not leaving hospital, which means that puts extra pressure on hospital beds. What's needed here is actually more staff in the community. We did a survey recently of home care staff, and they tell some horrific stories about the standard of care that they're forced to deliver. Essentially, there's been a race to the bottom in home care, largely under the radar, and we'd like to see the Scottish Government take concerted action to tackle that issue.
Thanks for joining us, Dave Watson there, Scottish organiser for Unison. Now, today is also a first chance for the leaders of the other Scottish political parties. Ruth Davidson, Kezia Dugdale, Willie Rennie and Patrick Harvey get to cross-examine the First Minister, but what will they want to ask her? David Clegg, political editor at the Daily Record, joins us now. David, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
So it's a big day, not just for you political journalists after the summer, but for the politicians as well.
Yes, indeed. We'll see Nicola Sturgeon today outline her priorities for government for the year ahead. Now, a lot of that has kind of changed over the summer with the BrExit result and the resulting fallout. So they're saying that I think BrExit will overshadow much of today's proceedings, and there will be a resultant focus on the economy, because there's an expectation that the uncertainty of the UK leaving the European Union will have some damaging impact on the Scottish economy. So I think Nicola Sturgeon will be quite keen to say that the Scottish Government is alive to this possibility and is going to do something to change it. Otherwise, I think we kind of have a good idea of what other legislation and what other measures are going to be in there, because Sturgeon has said quite explicitly that this is going to be about the nuts and bolts of delivering the manifesto. So I think things like the Social Security Act, using the new welfare powers, the Warm Homes Act, a Climate Change Act, possibly even something on land ownership, all these things that were laid out in the SNP manifesto for May's Holyrood election, I think we'll be getting reference to. We know that there's a specific focus on education and health, and I think even with Brexit and the resulting constitutional confusion, whatever happens, John Swinney, the Education Secretary, is going to be judged on how the SNP get on at narrowing the attainment gap over the course of this Parliament. So I expect we'll see a bit of a focus on that as well. And
despite this want maybe to move away from Brexit to an extent and focus on these domestic issues, how successful do you think, particularly Kezia Dugdale, who keeps saying, also in reference to a second independence referendum, that we're being diverted away from the things that can actually be changed here in Scotland. How keen do you think she will be to push that today? Well,
I think she'll be very keen for strategic as well as philosophical reasons, and every time they talk about the Constitution, the Scottish Labour Party suffers, because it is an area where they're kind of at sea and can't even really agree with themselves on what their position should be. Kezia Dugdale, the Scottish Labour leader, has laid out an alternative programme for government. She did that last week, and she has some, pretty meaty policies there. It was largely what was in the Scottish Labour manifesto, but it does give her a checklist that she can come back. And the fact that the tax raising powers are part of the equation for the first time means that whenever she's demanding something different from the government, the old excuse used to be, well, how are you going to pay for it? Well, now Scottish Labour have a different tax position. They've said they would raise tax to fund it, so they can say that with some more credibility. But I think at the end of the day, given the overwhelming focus at a UK level on Brexit and the particular Scottish dimension that brings with it as regards to a second independence referendum, means that is always going to be hovering in the background as we discuss domestic policy over the next 12 months.
And Ruth Davidson said and was elected recently on this pledge to be a strong opposition voice. Do you think she'll be very prepped today to maybe throw a few things at the Scottish Government?
Well, they've called for a Warm Homes Act in the statement from Ruth Davidson that was trailed overnight. Now, that was in the SNP manifesto, so I expect they to get that. I think also with the constitutional issue, whereas Labour are uncertain and unhappy whenever the Constitution is dominating, it actually quite suits the Scottish Conservatives as well, because they just come at it from the other side. They're the bulwark of the union. They're the ones who say definitely no more referendums. Let's just get on with the day-to-day governing of the country. So it kind of suits Ruth Davidson because it plays to her supporters as well whenever the focus is on that, and she can gee them up with a pro-union sentiment rather than a pro-independence sentiment.
And very quickly, David, what kind of tone are you expecting today from the First Minister?
I think she'll mention BrExit. That will be the kind of framework, but then there will be a focus on policy, and she will be very determined to say, while BrExit has changed the game in some regards and the constitutional question is again open, I'm very much determined to get down to business and do a good job governing the country. And I guess the proof of that will be in the eating.
David Clegg of the Daily Record, thank you.